I thought my daughter-in-law was simply rude until I came home early and heard her laughing on the phone. I'll make her so uncomfortable, she'll leave on her own. I stood behind that door in silence. Then I reached for my phone and made a decision she never saw coming. The smell of burnt toast drifted into the hallway before I even reached the kitchen. I adjusted my cardigan, my fingers brushing against the familiar smooth cotton. At 64, after 30 years of managing logistics for Denver's regional transit system, I noticed small details instinctively. Today, the details spoke of deliberate disrespect. My daughter-in-law Vivienne sat at my dining table, clicking her polished nails against her phone screen, while my son Ryan stared quietly into his mug. "Good morning, Mom," Ryan muttered without looking up. His shoulders leaned inward, a posture he always adopted when tension filled the room. "Morning, Ryan," I replied, walking toward the coffee maker. I noticed my hand-painted porcelain mugs had been moved to the top shelf, replaced by cheap plastic tumblers Vivienne preferred. Vivienne didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she slid a printed document across the wooden table. "We need to talk about the garage space, Evelyn. I'm converting it into my boutique's packaging studio starting Monday. You'll need to park your Subaru on the driveway." I poured my coffee, keeping my hand steady. The house belonged to me paid off completely 3 years after my husband passed. Ryan and Vivienne had moved in 8 months ago to save for a down payment, a temporary arrangement that was rapidly stretching. "The garage holds my winter supplies and woodworking tools, Vivienne," I said, softly sitting down opposite her. "We agreed that space remains mine." Vivienne let out a sharp, amused laugh. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with dismissive confidence. "Things change, Evelyn. My business brings actual revenue into this family now." "What are you going to do? Mom demand rent?" Ryan flinched, but remained silent, taking another slow sip of cold coffee. I felt the familiar pang of disappointment in my chest, but I didn't let my expression alter. I simply took a calm sip of my drink, watching her closely. "I'll think about it," I said. By Tuesday afternoon, the garage was already half-cluttered with stacked cardboard boxes and rolls of bubble wrap. Vivienne had not waited for my decision. When I returned from my weekly volunteer shift at the community library, her delivery van was parked squarely across my side of the driveway. I carried my groceries into the kitchen, finding the pantry completely reorganized. My baking supplies were packed into unlabeled plastic totes on the floor, while Vivienne's organic protein powders and meal prep containers occupied the eye-level shelves. Ryan walked in a few minutes later wearing his work lanyard. He looked exhausted. His tie loosened at the collar. "Mom, I know the garage isn't ideal." He started, his voice defensive before I had even spoken. "But Vivienne's online store had a huge quarter. She really needs the space." "She didn't ask Ryan. She informed me," I said, setting a carton of eggs onto the counter. "And now my belongings are piled beside the water heater. It's just temporary." He claimed, repeating the same phrase he had used 6 months ago when they took over the home office. "She's under a lot of stress. Can't you just let this one go?" "I've let several things go," I pointed out evenly. I gave up the sunroom for her live stream backdrop. I adjusted my grocery budget to fit her dietary demands. "There's a difference between hospitality and displacement." Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's my wife, Mom. You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I am standing in my own home, Ryan," I replied, keeping my voice firm and level. "That isn't an act of aggression." He didn't answer. He picked up an apple from the bowl and walked out toward the living room, leaving the pantry door hanging open. I systematically began moving my baking supplies back to their original shelf, one heavy glass jar at a time. On Thursday morning, I altered my schedule. Normally, I prepared a large breakfast for the 3 of us before Ryan left for his insurance firm. Today, I woke up at 6, brewed a single cup of coffee, and ate a small bowl of oatmeal on my back porch. When Vivienne came downstairs at 7, full of her usual rapid-fire demands about dry cleaning and package pickups, she found the kitchen cold and clean. The counters were cleared and the coffee pot was empty. "Where's the breakfast spread?" she asked, frowning as she opened the bare refrigerator. Ryan has an early client meeting and I have 3 shipments going out. The diner on 5th Street opens at 6:30. I said, folding my morning newspaper neatly on the patio table. I'm no longer managing the household meal schedule. Vivian scoffed, tapping her foot against the hardwood floor. Are you throwing a tantrum because of the garage, Evelyn? That's remarkably immature for someone your age. It's a practical reallocation of my time, I answered calmly. I'm taking a morning walking class at the rec center. Ryan came down the stairs, struggling with his jacket sleeve. Mom, did you see my blue tie? Check your bedroom closet, Ryan, I said, without looking up from my paper. I returned all your laundered clothes to your room yesterday. They exchange a brief, annoyed glance. Ryan looked confused by the lack of prepared breakfast, while Vivian merely shook her head in disdain. They left 10 minutes later, slamming the front door behind them. I didn't rush to clean up the 2 mugs they left in the sink. Instead, I put on my walking shoes, locked the front door securely, and set out into the crisp autumn morning air. For the first time in months, the house behind me felt completely quiet, waiting for my return on my own terms. The following Monday, I returned home earlier than expected. The library had closed early for floor maintenance, giving me an extra 2 hours in the afternoon. I entered through the side kitchen door, quietly kicking off my flats in the mudroom. Voices carried clearly from the living room. Vivian was on speakerphone with her mother, her tone sharp and triumphant. It's practically ours anyway. Vivian was saying, the sound of her glass tumbler clinking against the coffee table. Evelyn doesn't use 80% of this place. She just putters around her little garden and reads old books. Ryan's already convinced her to give up the office and the garage. Does she plan on downsizing soon? Her mother's muffled voice asked over the line. She will once I make things uncomfortable enough, Vivian replied with a short laugh. Ryan won't ever tell me no. He's too afraid of conflict. By next spring, we'll have the whole upper floor converted, or we'll just buy her out for cheap. She doesn't have the energy to fight us. I stood motionless in the mudroom, feeling the cool air from the doorframe press against my back. There was no sudden outburst of anger, only a cold, sharp clarity settling over my thoughts. I had spent 8 months trying to be accommodating, mistaking my own patience for kindness, while she had mistrusted it as weakness. I stepped softly back out the door, letting it latch silently shut. I walked down the driveway to my Subaru, sat in the driver's seat, and took 3 deep, measured breaths. My years in transit management had taught me one fundamental rule: when a system is being intentionally disrupted, you don't argue with the operator, you simply reroute the entire line. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local branch of my banking institution. That evening, the atmosphere at dinner was heavy. I had prepared a simple chicken dish for myself, leaving the rest of the kitchen clean and available. When Ryan and Vivienne sat down with their takeout, I remained at the table with my journal. Mom, Vivienne said you were acting distant today. Ryan began opening a plastic container of sushi. Is everything okay? Everything is clear, Ryan, I said, laying my pen down beside the notebook. I've spent the afternoon reviewing my household expenses and property management. Vivian rolled her eyes, dipping a roll into soy sauce. Here we go again with the garage drama. Evelyn, I told you my business is scaling. You need to accept that this house has to function for working adults. This house functions because I pay the property taxes, the structural insurance, and the municipal utilities. I said, my voice steady and unhurried. And starting next month, those operational costs will be reevaluated. Ryan paused, his chopsticks hovering midair. What do you mean, reevaluated? You both earn full-time incomes. I explained, looking directly at my son. For 8 months, I have covered all housing costs to help you save. However, since my space is being systematically reallocated for commercial use without my consent, we need formal leases and shared utility agreements. Vivian laughed loudly, a harsh sound that echoed in the dining room. A formal lease? From your own son? You're joking. I don't joke about legal property rights, Vivian, I replied softly. We aren't signing anything. Vivian declared, slamming her container lid shut. Ryan, tell your mother this is absurd. We're family, not your tenants. Ryan looked between us, his face flushing with deep embarrassment. Mom can't. We just talk about this without bringing paperwork into it. We are talking about it now, I said, closing my journal. And my decision is made. Over the next 3 days, I didn't engage in petty arguments. When Vivian left her inventory boxes in the hallway, I neatly stacked them back inside her car trunk. When Ryan tried to apologize in passing, I listened, politely, gave him a brief hug, and returned to my tasks. I spent Wednesday morning at my attorney's office downtown. Mr. Vance had managed my late husband's estate, and he understood my priorities completely. You're fully within your rights, Evelyn, Mr. Vance said, reviewing the property title on his desk. Since there is no formal lease agreement currently registered, they are residing here under an informal tenancy at will. You hold total legal authority over the premises and all municipal accounts registered under your name. I don't want a bitter legal feud, Arthur, I told him, leaning forward. I simply want my home restored to its proper balance. I want my son to understand accountability, and I want my space respected. Then we issue a formal notice of terms. He advised drafting a document on his computer. It sets clear boundaries, outlines financial contributions, and establishes a firm timeline for residential use. Print it, I said. That afternoon, I visited the hardware store on Grand Avenue. I purchased a set of heavy-duty keypad deadbolts, 3 high-rated security padlocks, and a set of heavy storage shelving units. I hired 2 local college students from the community bulletin board to meet me at the house early the following morning. When I got home, Ryan was sitting alone on the porch steps, holding a cold cup of coffee. He looked up as I pulled into the driveway. Mom, he said softly, standing up as I stepped out of the car. I feel like I'm losing you. You aren't losing me, Ryan, I answered, placing a hand on his arm. You're just finally seeing me. On Friday morning, Vivian took her disrespect a step too far. I woke up at 7 to the sound of heavy boots moving upstairs. When I opened my bedroom door, 2 men in overalls were carrying my antique oak armoire out of the guest room. What is happening here? I asked, stopping them in the hallway. Vivian walked out of the room holding a clipboard and looking completely unbothered. I hired a local crew to clear this room out today, Evelyn. My photographer needs the natural light in here for our autumn catalog shoot. We're moving your old furniture down to the basement. You did not ask permission to enter that room, nor to move my mother's furniture, I said, my voice dropping an octave, perfectly controlled. It was just sitting there unused. Vivian snapped her composure, slipping into outright hostility. You're holding this entire house back with your sentimental junk. We live here too, in case you forgot. You live here as my guests, I corrected her firmly. Men set that armoire down immediately and leave my house. The 2 workers looked uncomfortably at each other, set the heavy oak piece against the wall, and quickly headed for the stairs. Hey, I paid you for 4 hours, Vivian shouted after them over the banister. She turned back to me, her face red with frustration. You just ruined a $1,200 photo shoot. What are you going to do? Mom, lock me out. Call the police on your own family. No, I said, looking her dead in the eye. I won't call the police. She sneered, crossing her arms tightly. That's what I thought. You're all talk. You won't do a single thing that risks your relationship with Ryan. She spun on her heel and slammed the guest room door behind her. I didn't yell. I didn't knock on her door. I walked downstairs, picked up my phone, and made one quiet, deliberate phone call before bed. The phone call was to my trusted utility accounts manager and my property attorney. Because the home was registered entirely under my name, I held sole administrative authority over every service tied to the address. Good evening, Evelyn, the representative said. How can I assist you with your residential accounts tonight? I need to initiate a temporary service suspension and account transfer for the commercial workshop extension registered at my address, I stated clearly. And I need to update the primary residential access protocol starting at 7 tomorrow morning. We can process the account split and utility hold immediately, she confirmed. I spent the next hour quietly organizing my personal documents, placing my property deed tax receipts and personal identification into a fireproof briefcase in my locked master bedroom. Around 10 o'clock, Ryan came home from a late work event. He walked into the kitchen where I was finishing a cup of chamomile tea. "Mom, Vivian texted me," he said, looking exhausted and anxious. "She said you kicked her photographer out." I stopped unauthorized people from removing my mother's furniture from my house. "Ryan," I corrected him gently, "there is a difference." "She's really upset," he muttered, leaning against the counter. "She says she can't run her business under these conditions." "She is entirely correct," I agreed smoothly. "She cannot run a commercial business inside a private residence without paying commercial utilities, maintaining proper liability insurance, or treating the homeowner with basic human courtesy." Ryan stared at me, opening his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the clean counters, the orderly kitchen, and the total calm in my eyes. "Get some sleep, Ryan," I said, setting my empty cup in the sink. "Tomorrow morning is going to be quite busy for everyone." He stood alone in the quiet kitchen as I walked upstairs, locking my bedroom door securely behind me. At precisely 7:45 the next morning, the college students I hired arrived. By 7:55, they had efficiently moved all of Vivian's inventory boxes, display racks, and shipping supplies out of my garage and onto the covered front porch, stacking them neatly under a waterproof tarp. At 8:00 a.m., sharp, the locksmith arrived and installed the new keypad locks on the garage, the sunroom, and the main entrance. At 8:05 a.m., heavy, furious pounding echoed through the front door. Pounding on my door, loud enough to shake the decorative wreath hanging on the frame. I walked down the hallway, wearing my comfortable sweater and holding my morning coffee. Through the side glass pane, I saw Vivian. Her hair was unstyled, her face flushed with fury, demanding to know what I'd done. Ryan stood behind her on the porch, looking wide-eyed at the neatly stacked inventory boxes beside him. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, halfway resting my hand against the frame. This time, I was the one smiling, a calm, pleasant, unshakable smile. "What is the meaning of this?" Vivian shrieked, pointing wildly at the tarp-covered boxes. "My entire inventory is out on the porch, and the garage lock is changed. What did you do to the power in the sunroom?" "Good morning, Vivian," I said pleasantly. "As the sole property owner, I have restored the garage and sunroom to their original residential functions. Your commercial inventory has been safely staged for transport." "You can't do this," she yelled, her voice cracking. "I have orders to ship by noon." "You can transport them to a rented commercial storage unit," I replied evenly. "Furthermore, the residential utility account no longer covers commercial power usage. If you wish to continue residing here, Ryan has the formal tenancy agreement in his email. It outlines a standard monthly rent and strict boundaries regarding common areas." Ryan stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "Mom, you locked the garage." "I secured my property, Ryan," I corrected him gently, looking at my son. "It's time for both of you to decide how you wish to live as adults." Vivian stared at me, her mouth open in utter shock. The dismissive confidence she had carried for 8 months completely evaporated under the weight of real, legal, and financial reality. She couldn't demand, she couldn't taunt, and she couldn't manipulate a system she didn't own. Ryan looked at his wife, then at the neatly stacked boxes, and finally at me. For the first time in months, a look of profound understanding washed over his face. He realized that my quiet nature was never weakness. It was simply patience, waiting for accountability. "She's right, Vivian," Ryan said quietly, his voice firmer than I had heard it in years. "We've been taking advantage of her." "Ryan," Vivian gasped, turning on him. "No," Ryan insisted, shaking his head. "She let us stay here to help us, and we turned her house into your warehouse. We're loading these boxes into my truck now." Vivian looked between us, realizing she had no remaining leverage. Without another word, she turned and marched toward the driveway to unlock her van. Over the next 3 weeks, Ryan and Vivian signed a formal temporary lease for the upper 2 bedrooms, paying a fair market rate that went directly into my personal savings account. The garage remained mine, fully restored to my woodworking tools and car. The sunroom once again held my morning coffee table and thriving fern collection. More importantly, the dynamic in my home fundamentally shifted. Vivian no longer spoke to me with casual condescension. When she entered the kitchen, she was polite, quiet, and respectful of my space. Ryan began taking active responsibility for their household contributions, growing more independent with each passing week. I sat on my back porch on a warm Sunday afternoon, sipping my tea and watching the sunlight filter through the oak trees. My boundaries were clear, my home was peaceful, and my life was entirely my own.